Hi, good day, folks, and glad you can join us today. I'm Peter Neufeld and part of the HR team here at Maple Leaf, and welcome to our Healthy Minds speaker series. We have today some great guests. Returning is Dr. Bill Howitt. Great to see you, Dr. Howitt.
Thank you.
And we also have someone else returning that we heard before, Dr. Craig Sawchuk.
Hey guys.
Dr. Sawchuk.
Great, thank you.
Just to remind you quickly in terms of kind of our process, so we have a short presentation, roughly 15 minutes, and then we end our time together with a Q&A. If you have any questions, just click on the link at the top right corner of the icon, and you can ask your questions at any time. So with that, Dr. Sawchuk, we met with you about 5 weeks ago, if you can believe it.
Yeah,
we always say these days go on in some ways quickly and in some days endless. And you were speaking about how to have a restful sleep. And maybe we'll check in with you before we hear about today's topic in terms of how have you been resting?
Yeah, well, as I've chatted with a number of folks that there's never a shortage of things going on in the mental health field. So I'm sure about 5 weeks ago when we talked about insomnia, all cured across the board. Yeah, just thinking with my own, sleep troubles, kind of here and there. Yeah, sometimes, just being human, it can be hard to practice what you preach. Sometimes when my sleep gets fragmented, I will get up and go into the other room and do those boring things until I get bored and sleepy. And then other times, like 2 nights ago, I just was tossing and turning for about an hour and a half, and the whole time I'm hearing myself talking about this. So behavior change is hard, but hopefully you guys are doing a better job with managing your insomnia maybe than I am.
No, that's awesome. So today you're going to be talking on worry. As we jump into it, maybe you can highlight a little bit in terms of some of the differences between worry and anxiety, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, and worry is, really a part. We think about a segment of anxiety, and we'll be talking about the anxiety cycle in just a couple of minutes. And it's really important that we all really try to recognize how does anxiety look for us, and that may provide some additional ideas and strategies. Where do you focus your time and your therapeutic effort in terms of managing your anxiety? Now, again, I love this series that Maple Leaf is putting on for everybody. It's talking about different pathways to just help us out, to help build up that resiliency, to help manage all the uncertainty that's going on these days. Today, in terms of going down the line, in terms of focusing in on how can we be good consumers of our own care, we're going to be talking about some evidence-based treatments for managing worry. We're focusing in on what is it that you're thinking about, or the content of our worries. This is not in competition with, but a little bit different from, say, some of the things on mindfulness and some of the other topics that you've talked about, where mindfulness in many ways we're focusing in on how emotions take our thinking out of the moment and how to work with that. So it's almost like focusing on the process of our thinking. Today, we're actually going to be focusing in on the content of our thinking. And we'll talk about some ways of looking at this and some basic strategies of going forward, knowing, again, that we're kind of skimming the surface here, but hopefully we can help you all be good consumers of your care going forward. So let's jump to the next slide. All right, so if you've got a pulse, you are probably experiencing some kind of worry. And once again, certainly you don't need a psychologist at this day and age to highlight that we're struggling with worries. We think about, and we've talked a lot about this, last time around insomnia, that there's a lot of different things going on in life right now that are creating uncertainties, new onset problems that we never really had anticipated, things that were once stable now are unstable. So this is activating actually a natural part of us that can at some point be too much of a good thing. So we think of how the brain works. I always come back to the brain. We are actually naturally hardwired to pay attention to threat. That is super adaptive in most circumstances. It's also designed to be adaptive to just be working short term. And of course, all of us have been experiencing more long-term activation of that threat because there's just lots of threat going on. what does worry actually do? It actually functions, its functional value is to help us plan and prepare for managing that threat and danger. So as we're anticipating these future-oriented threats or trying to figure out how we're going to problem solve the current stressors that we're experiencing, say with our job or our finances or health or relationships, we're also trying to figure it out, as well too. And again, historically, or more often than not, once we think about it, once we figure it out, once we come up with a relative plan, boom, it shuts down. The problem is, though, that we're exposed to so much threat right now, marinating literally in threat right now. It's hard for that brain to shut off. And again, in all fairness, many of us are dealing with new threats that we maybe don't have a playbook, to deal with. So we think of like our experiences and what's currently going on in our environment kind of starts to act as that filter, and how these experiences come into us go through that filter. And one way that things start to change is the flexibility of our thinking. As emotions go up, the flexibility of our thinking goes down. And this is actually true for all emotions. We think of the more anxious and stressed we get, the less flexible our thinking becomes. If we're super mad or pissed at somebody, we're less flexible our thinking. If we're really sad and down, less flexible with our thinking. But this is a fundamental feature of all human emotions. So even more positive emotions, if we're really stoked or excited about certain things, our flexibility in our thinking is also pretty low as well too. But usually we've got our rose-colored glasses on, so we just let people be. But that's such an important part of a case formulation in terms of how we think about thinking about our thinking, and going after that is really working on regaining flexibility in our thinking. There's also information processing biases that are very, very automatic, and there's 3 information processing biases that happen. One is memory. So if we're in a pretty anxious state, the first things that we remember are all the other instances in which things went bad or went poorly. Those things come to mind a lot quicker. Just because they're there, that doesn't necessarily mean that's all what's going on here. There's also attentional biases. We're much more likely to orient ourselves, pay attention to more threatening information or information that's consistent with that emotion. So if we're pretty stressed or anxious, we're much more likely to focus in on that part of the news or those things going on in our lives right now that are more threatening, rather than trying to balance things out. And then there's also the third type of information processing bias is interpretation. So when things are more vague, when things are uncertain, when we look through that lens and we're anxious, we're much more likely to interpret those in a negative way. This isn't on purpose either. We're not actively choosing to think this way. This is just how the brain works. So it's important that we know how the brain works. So almost like engineers, we can learn how to work with that and start to shift it around. So at what point does it become too much of a good thing? It's like a miswiring of the alarm system. Worry is good and adaptive, but sometimes that alarm system gets miswired in 3 ways. One is that when the alarm goes off, it's too loud. So we're not only worrying about some minor outcomes, we're worrying about worst case scenario outcomes. We're having panicky symptoms along that at the same time. When the alarm goes off, it's going off for too long. We have a hard time settling it down. Many of us struggle with, once we start to worry, there's another part of our brain saying, I don't need to worry about this. I don't want to be thinking about this, but we have a hard time settling it down, especially at night. Then there's the false alarm type of effect that at many times when we're trying to relax, when we're trying to have that quiet time, it can still be intrusive on us. So that alarm system gets miswired. So let's flip to the next slide. So kind of making sense of this worry cycle. Anxiety works like a cycle to keep itself going. It's only in the business to keep itself going. So we think of anxiety, the emotional label we strap to that, in addition to the raw physical activation of our fight or flight response, also changes our information processing, and that leads to the negative thinking. And that's what we're going to be focusing in on in just a few minutes. But again, our negative thoughts are primed and influenced by our emotions, and in turn also influences what we do, the behavioral side of things. And again, when anxiety gets to a certain point, where it starts to interfere with our functioning and our day-to-day living, there's two types of behaviors that tend to come out. One is the not doing enough of something kind of behavior, so that's more classic avoidant behaviors. And then we also look at the doing too much of something kind of behaviors. So this could be things that could be like excess substance use, it could be seeking reassurance, could be doing checking, related behaviors. It all makes sense, and it's all a way that's influenced by anxiety, and we'll keep it going. But we're going to be focusing in on the negative thought part of that cycle. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so try to think about it this way. There's really kind of two parts to the equation here. One is perceived threat, and one is our perceived ability to cope. And anxiety, and especially clinical anxiety, will try to drive a wedge between the two of those. So one, we focus in on the threat, and this doesn't matter if we're talking about health things, if you're particularly socially anxious, if you're worried about your job or finances or work or school. Perceived threat, anxiety, clinical anxiety, doesn't bother itself with boring things. It's more catastrophic, more worst case scenario. It's not only going to be bad, it's going to be horrible. We also tend to overestimate the likelihood of those bad things happening. It's kind of like the imminent risk type of idea. So it just amplifies the nature of the threat. Those are the first things that come to mind. And at the same time, we start to doubt our ability to cope, to deal with, to recover, from these circumstances. So try to think of, perceived threat and perceived ability to cope. Usually for most things kind of go side by side, but then what clinical anxiety does is it amplifies the threat, not only in terms of the worst case scenario, but it feeling like we're walking on a minefield, literally. So it increases that sense of likelihood, but then also underestimates our ability to cope. We start to doubt our ability to cope and recover. So somewhere there's a math equation, I'm sure, that the distance between the two will determine how bad a particular instance is. And remember, as emotions get cranked up, flexibility of thinking goes down, and those things are exactly the types of thoughts that come to mind first. Keep that cycle going. And then depending upon the individual, there may be some additional themes that tend to go on, and this is where we get into some of the idiosyncratic parts of just our own lives and our own context. There may be some additional themes that go along, like difficulties tolerating uncertainty. That's a big one right now. Uncertainty is like gasoline in the fire. Our anxiety is trying to figure it out. Sometimes we get in this all or nothing two-box thinking. It's either all good or all bad. And of course, if we're not feeling great, we look at things as being in an all bad way. Or sometimes we got these beliefs that I should be able to control all my thoughts, but in fact, the mind has a mind of its own. So sometimes there are some additional themes that may be contributing to the uniqueness, of our situation. Responsibility is a big theme going on right now that oftentimes is associated with guilt. Like I should be able to take care of this, or I should be able to stay connected, with my family members. And in turn, I'm feeling guilty because I can't, because of social distancing and practicing safe guidelines. But anxiety and guilt just beat us up over it. But our thinking, that's something that we can actually learn to manage and to work on. So let's skip to the next slide. So we're going to walk through just a simple way, and I fully know that we're just going through this, fairly quick, but this can be a really, really helpful way to go after the content of our worry. What is it that we're worrying about? And I want people to think about this. We're not aiming to turn this off. Like, I don't want to be worrying at all. That's not healthy. That's not normal. If the light switch is off on your worry, then again, we need to check a pulse on you. Try to think about it like a dimmer switch or a volume knob. We're trying to teach some skills to kind of tune it down, because for the vast majority of us, these worries are possibilities. They are possibilities in a range of possibilities. And I think that's sometimes one of the problems that some people run into right out of the gate, is that they have to attack their negative thoughts like a lawyer would, prove them wrong, or we're assuming that you're being irrational. That's really actually not the case for a lot of worries that we deal with. We have to work with them. But in order to work with them, to gain flexibility of our thinking, we actually have to write it down. So this is something that trying to manage our worries in our head, good luck. It's not going to go very far. We have to actually write it down. And it's a deeper level of learning. It's a deeper level of information processing. And we're going to walk through just like almost like a template, a way to take almost any kind of thought and worry and go through it. And some of the things that we're looking at is come back to the idea is we're just trying to generate alternatives. We're not trying to prove our negative thoughts wrong or come up with more believable alternatives. We're actually just trying to come up with alternatives. That is really the key. It's a learned process, writing down alternatives. That's really what we're going after for. And when you actually start to look at your worries, when you get them on like this side of your eyeballs and you're kind of like looking at those worries, pay attention to the language. Language really matters. Words really matter. It's remarkable how frequent, certain words in the English and French language, come up that are signs of more or less flexible thinking. So words like always, must, never, should. It's remarkable how frequent those ones come to mind. And then likewise, when we're actually working through gaining flexibility in our thinking, words matter. So more flexible words like maybe, might, possibly, could, getting those things down on paper actually start to help us gain flexibility and improve our tolerance for uncertainty. So additional ways of thinking about this is treat our thoughts just like hypotheses. They're possibilities in a range of possibilities. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at other potential less bad outcomes. And then also knowing that feelings are information and they can be very strong and sometimes they're factual, but not all the time and all the case. Again, our thinking is influenced by our feelings and vice versa. So let's try to look at things a little bit deeper. So if we go to the next slide, here is just like a good take-home resource. I believe our colleagues with Maple Leaf will make available this sheet that you're seeing up on the screen, and as well this bookending exercise. But here is a way to kind of a first pass way through of going through that work of worry management, challenging our negative thoughts. It's like a 3-box phenomenon. So the first one is just super brief description of the situation. Sometimes these situations just kind of come out of the blue, like I'm laying in bed or I'm just driving home from work and the thoughts just kind of pop in, or sometimes they're triggered, by things. So I get notification of a furlough, or maybe just a vague email from my supervisor saying, okay, we've got a meeting today at 1:45. Situation happens, boom, kind of gets our anxiety going. And then that middle box, that second box, is just listing up to 5 doubts, worries, concerns, what if, kinds of thoughts. No more than 5 in that box, because sometimes we can go on and on and on and on and on, with our worries, but compartmentalizing them, getting a sample and then moving on them, that's really the key. And remember, getting those worries on this side of your eyeballs is a first step going towards going after these worries and identifying, some of these things that go on, like the worries that I will lose my job. There's no way I'm going to be able to cover this. What if I go back to work and I get sick? So all of these worries, those aren't crazy thoughts at all. Those can be very realistic worries that we're facing, but those are only certain ways of looking at the situation. That's why the real work of this and the heavier lifting comes down below with challenging these thoughts. And there's, again, 4 quick ways of going through this, and I apologize for going through this a little bit quickly, but the first one is the essence of the exercise. Just simply, what's another way of looking at the situation? What are other possible outcomes here? An adage to keep in mind is thinking good is bad, thinking less bad is good. So if you think about cognitive flexibility, here's regular everyday concern and worry. This is what anxiety will do to you. It will bring out more catastrophic, worst case scenario thoughts, like I'm going to lose my job. Trying to challenge that by jumping in the opposite direction with an overly positive thought, like, hey, everything will be okay, don't worry about it. That is too far for your brain to jump. And secondly, it's probably not very respectful to the circumstances that you find yourself in. So looking at it in a less bad way is good. So trying to aim more so over here, like this could be a furlough, could be temporary, or actually, I don't know what this meeting is about yet. So I guess I'll find out once I get there. Those aren't positive thoughts, but they're less bad thoughts. So remember, less bad is good. The second question goes after, based upon my actual past experience or experiences, how likely are these negative thoughts to be true? So kind of pay attention to, especially like when we have redundant anticipatory thoughts and worries, we're not saying that these bad things can happen, but what does your actual past history suggest? Even if you're having doubts about being able to handle or cope with difficult things or circumstances, what's your batting average, actually look like in dealing with bad thoughts in or stressful circumstances in the past? And again, for at least my colleagues in Toronto, they have a better sense of batting average with the Maple Leafs, but I'll go with save percentage as I got my hockey tie on for you guys this time around. And then the last two thoughts really do treat our thoughts like hypotheses. Do I have any objective evidence that supports these thoughts? And in times like this, we actually probably do have more objective evidence about the instability of work. There have been layoffs. There have been cutbacks right now. The company is maybe struggling, financially. Those are objective things that are going on. Sometimes it can be a really interesting exercise when we actually work on trying to come up with objective evidence for some of our worries. Sometimes we actually struggle, with coming up with them. And then likewise, the last question, what objective evidence would I need to be 100% certain that these negative thoughts were true? What would you need to know? What would need to be going on in order to be 100% certain that this is exactly what's happening? So if we're worrying about losing our job, what would a high-risk individual look like losing their job? Well, I probably have a poor work history, maybe written up multiple times, multiple layoffs going on, being told that we are going to be doing layoffs at this time. So again, just trying to look at our thinking in a variety of ways. I've highlighted just on the side, and we're not going to spend too much time going through this bookending exercise, but this can be a really, really helpful tool, especially when we're dealing with the anticipation of getting back into stressful situations, whether it be work, whether it be starting to relax on social distancing, and health-related worries are coming to mind. Before we get into the situation, do this exact exercise we just walked through. You have two sets of hypotheses. When you're actually in the situation, keep both sets of those hypotheses in mind, my negative thoughts and my alternate thoughts, and what is your experience telling you? And the back end of the bookend is after the situation is over, go right back to the beginning again and really focus in on what actually happened. This helps with that learning. It helps with that flexibility of our thinking over time. So let's switch to the last slide. And just some resources to get people going. I know our HR folks at Maple Leaf have been sharing lots of resources with you. Here are just some really, really good ones. If you're the type of person who likes to work through a treatment manual, these are two great evidence-based ones that not only go into how do we cognitively work on in an evidence-based way or worry, but also have some other good anxiety management things. So Mastery of Your Anxiety and Worry. Great book, Dave Tolan's Face Your Fears, also a really good one as well. And another, shout out to the great work being done up in Canada, and the Ottawa Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Institute has this great podcast out right now, and they talk about managing worry in the context of COVID-19. In addition, they have other podcasts about managing addiction, depression, some parenting things. So awesome tips and skills from leaders in the field and very practical things. So once again, thank you all so much for taking the time to listen to the rocketed way through managing anxiety and worry, but hopefully it helps to make us good consumers of our care. So I'll be happy to work with Dr. Howitt with fielding some questions. And then also after the fact, like we did with some of the insomnia, some great questions came after the talk. So I'm happy to address those alongside of Dr. Howitt as well.
Thank you, Dr. Sawchuk. As you've mentioned before, if we don't get to your questions today, we will do our best to respond to them after the session. So again, people feel free to ask your questions. One of the ones you've been talking about, and the question is around the way that you're talking about managing your thinking. Is this similar to what people describe as reframing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing. It goes by many forms: cognitive challenging, worry management, reframing. Whichever one works best for you, that's what it's about. And it's just, again, focusing on more flexibility in our thinking.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful when you're talking about that flexibility. And I think, what we're hearing a lot is that people kind of go down a certain path with kind of vigor and commitment. And that creates kind of a rut where it's harder to be getting out of.
Yeah.
A person has asked a question here about, is it how they've said, I've been trying not to worry but about things I cannot control. It seems inevitable with COVID, with race protests, many things that in media that are stimulating people. And the question is this a healthy approach, or should I allow all worry in and try and go through this process? So they're kind of framing some out and saying, is that an effective way?
Yeah, it sounds good on paper. Hey, just, focus on what you can control, let go what you can't control. And honestly, there's, I don't know, maybe 2% of the population that seemingly can do that. I'm a psychologist and I have no idea how to do that. So what we do need to do on top of some of the other great things I'm sure you guys have talked about, like with building up resilience and other things, limiting our exposure to media, is really focusing in on those pockets, those themes of worry that you can actually go after. Set aside scheduled time during the day to be able to do that. So you're at least, remember we're talking a little bit about scheduling our thinking with insomnia. This can also be like a way that we put aside maybe 20 minutes a day where I'm going to focus in on my worries. But you know what, rather than, well, I'm going to focus in on the social injustices, the financial, things going on with my work, the health of one of my children. Again, anxiety is going to want you to bounce around like a bingo ball machine in every direction. Let's kind of pin down maybe one of those themes and focus in on that as well too. And even some things that we honestly feel that we can't control, which are many things right now, even starting to wrap our thinking around it in a more healthy, strategic and structured way can actually be quite helpful.
Yeah, I'll just say a quick thing. I don't think you can stop worry. I could think that'll create additional worry trying to stop it, but I think you can facilitate it using much of what you've talked about. So it's setting your expectation up front as well.
Right. And that's why, sometimes very well-intended advice, like, hey, don't worry about it, just think positively, it doesn't work. It kind of sucks. And it's a process that we need to work on over time, and it is a skill. We are all living in really, really unusual circumstances, and I know that is the grand understatement of the term right now, but that is creating unusual experiences for us to manage. So we are all worrying. We just, through worry management on top of some of these other wellness and resiliency skills, we're just trying to turn it into more of a fair fight for us.
So there's a question here, and it's asking about, it says, how would you suggest approaching your leader without the concern that the leader will think that you're slacking off? Because you've kind of given a systematic approach, and the person is concerned about that it might be misinterpreted.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. A couple of things. One, that's a worry. That's anticipatory anxiety. So that could be, what if, my supervisor, my leader thinks I'm slacking off or complaining? So that is a potential what if. That could be true, maybe not. Are there other ways of looking at this? So writing down, using that as an opportunity to do the bookending exercise is great. Sometimes even just a quick communication skill. It's called a preemptive strike, where if we anticipate what the negative interpretation may be on the other side, maybe we call it out initially. Hey, I want to spend some time chatting with you about some of the concerns that I'm having. I don't want you to interpret this as that I'm complaining or slacking, but here. So you kind of preemptively address what the concern may be and get into it. I think anytime we're dealing with more emotionally charged conversations, which are really important, it's important to have our voice. Remember, as emotions get cranked up, flexibility of thinking goes down. It can sometimes be hard to remember what we want to talk about. So maybe just prepare just a couple of bulleted points that you want to make sure that you get across, and do a little bit of that prep work, and that can be helpful.
Excellent. Do you have any other tips in terms of looking at, in terms of increasing the flexibility? And what you've described here is doing it on paper. What do you think about talking to other people?
Right. So in terms of increasing your flexibility, I am not recommending at all any mind-altering drugs that will kind of blow your mind and increase your flexibility, put you on a different plane of existence. Don't do that, not healthy. This is where all the resilient stuff can be so good. And we do know from our research with mindfulness skills, acceptance and commitment therapy, they've actually have, some measures of cognitive flexibility. But even things like we were talking about 5 weeks ago with insomnia, getting some exercise, changing up the scenery, giving your brain some novelty, tuning out, watch what we're feeding our brain in terms of negativity, all of that can help. One of the things that I love about being Canadian is we've got a great sense of humor about things. And as soon as we start to lose our humor, that can be a problem. So always try to look for those things that can help with our mood, help elevate things, help us to look at things in a less serious way. Not saying that that means that we are taking things less seriously, but humor can actually go a long way in terms of helping with that flexibility. I think it's a multi-dimensional, multi-pathway approach that we need to take.
Yeah, I would add too, Beacon and Starling both have online free ICBD. You don't have to have an anxiety disorder to benefit from practicing some of these exercises. So if you're looking for a little bit more structure, you can log on and do these courses. Also, Yale has an amazing course, The Science of Happiness, right now, but 2 million people have done it free. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about it, because it's sometimes hard to do this stuff without someone providing the structure. That's from being a CBT person. The client does the work, but by me giving them the structure, it helps. So maybe some different resources, Peter. People can go through some training and development and get some practice as well.
So folks, we're at the end of our time today. It always goes by quickly. I think it's a perfect segue though in terms of, and this wasn't a plant, but we are actually looking into happiness for our next topic. And so stay tuned for who we'll have on deck for that. Dr. Sawchuk, thank you so much for being with us. Dr. Howard, thank you so much. And I wish all of you a great day and see you soon.
All right, take care everyone.
Bye-bye.